Who actually controls trade policy in this country? The Supreme Court just ruled 6-3 that the president cannot use emergency powers to impose tariffs. AIPA doesn't give you that kind of authority. Done. Clear as day. And for about 2 hours, that was the main story. Then President Trump invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a law most Americans have never heard of, and announced a new global tariff. It started at 10%. Less than 24 hours had passed, it was raised to 15%. Now, here's the part you need to understand. Section 122 has a 150-day clock. So the question isn't whether these tariffs are legal. They may or may not be. It's what happens on day 151. And is the president still popular enough to push this type of policy through? Here to help us answer all those questions is none other than my friend and colleague, Mr. Mike Termott, famed economist, I might add. Mr. Mike Termott. Mike, how are you doing today?
It's great to be with you, John. As always, you have oversold my participation in the conversation. I am glad to be with you, though, and particularly for a conversation that is about the separation of powers, which I find particularly ironic, given that when you and I separate authority over controlling this podcast, you've explained to me more than once, I just do whatever you say. So we understand how this works. We don't have the Supreme Court to protect me and the extent to which I am, obliged to just follow your conversation. I also think, you oversold when you said famed that's not true. I am an economist and I have taught international trade, but unless any of my students are actually watching our podcast, which of course is not impossible, I don't think anyone would find that either full of fame or infamy.
Well, I would take issue with that, but also you have to adopt a little bit of the president's bravado and bluster. You are a famed economist, and you should present yourself as such.
But greatest economist of all time.
The hugest economist of all time. But huge. Anyway, but Mike, it's very interesting because, on the surface, this is an economic issue, right? Like, very surface level. How do tariffs affect the economy, whether they're good for the economy? Then you have the next layer of it, which is the president has gone to great lengths to implement something that he's been a big fan of. I'd like to think since he was a teenager. Growing up in New York, that's all. Even when he wasn't involved in politics, that's all you heard him talk about was we need to tariff, and especially the Chinese.
Yep.
Then there's the third layer, which is having been rebuffed by the Supreme Court, his insistence on pushing through this economic policy. There's so many different layers to this. And then there's the populist point of view. So let's start off at the beginning. The Supreme Court basically, and I'm really dumbing this down for everyone, said that the emergency powers the president used to implement his tariffs were unconstitutional. That while he has the power to regulate trade, he does not have the power to tax. Tariffs are taxes. That is a congressional power. That's a legislative power, not an executive power. Very quickly, Mike, what was your thoughts on the 6-3 ruling? There were some notable dissensions, Clarence Thomas being the most notable thereof. What did you think of that opinion handed down by the Supreme Court? Relatively,
I don't think there's much question it was the right opinion. Look, the IEPPA is a law that allows the president to regulate trade under certain circumstances, including his declaration that there was an emergency. That's all fine. The problem is that the White House found itself having to argue that this regulatory authority included setting tariffs. But the law doesn't specifically say tariffs. But the Constitution does specifically say taxes, and tariffs are taxes, are under the auspices of Congress. And Congress did not give away, nor can Congress give away, its control over tariffs. So it was a fairly straightforward case. What's really fascinating is the extent to which 3 justices wrote opposite opinions that came to the other conclusion that ruled in favor of the White House having this authority. I found that completely fascinating. In Clarence Thomas's case, he went so far as to say that Congress can give away its authority to control tariffs, and effectively has, by virtue of having written this law that tariffs are a part of his regulatory authority. There are plenty of other laws that have not really come up, but demonstrate that Congress can give away its tariff authority. It was really fascinating. And the other justices who disagreed with the opinion also made the argument that Congress can give away this authority and effectively has. And John, one of the things that's really interesting, just to go with you into the weeds here just for a moment,
sure,
is that the liberal justices who agreed with the majority opinion did not agree with the three conservatives who voted against it. In other words, they said, in this particular case, the president hasn't the authority to impose tariffs. But can Congress give away tariff authority? Absolutely, or they can give away any other authority, because the liberal justices do not want to live in a world in which Congress cannot tell the president, you do you. You just do whatever you want, because the liberals are all about allowing the executive branch to increase its authority. So I thought that was actually fascinating how the various justices.
The politics of the mechanics, which is not surface evident, perhaps, is fascinating here. You're absolutely right. You would have thought that all the quote conservative judges would have voted across the slate to, you have to limit the executive. You can't just assume executive authority and then pick apart each one, right? And whereas you would think the liberals being, you need some latitude here. The president, he can do some good. Now, before we go into the political fallout, which I think will be just as fascinating as the statutory and economic fallout, but let's talk about the statutory stuff. So they ruled these things, these tariffs, illegal. And I think the president did himself no favors by tariffing the entire world at the same time. Because it's hard to declare an emergency like that, right? It's not like, it's self-evident.
Right. He's effectively claiming that our balance of payments presents an emergency.
Well, that's for Section 122, which I wanted to ask you about, right?
Which is where we are today.
Right. Section 122, which is the part of the trade law that has now been invoked by the president, it was written very specifically where the president can impose tariffs up to 15% for a maximum of 150 days, as he sees fit, to correct balance of payments. Now, what's interesting here is two things. A, this lasts for 5 months, essentially, 150 days. Secondly, you, me, and the president, and Scott Besson, and whoever else cooked up this nonsense, have probably different definitions of balance of payments. I'm pretty sure that President Trump views balance of payments as trade deficits.
Yep.
Whereas you and I probably mean balance of payments as someone is not paying us what they owe us. So do you want to talk a little bit about how the president is declaring a balance of payments crisis, which, by the way, requires an investigation and blah, 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 blah.
Sure. The president is invoking Section 122 here, which is based on the idea that too much money is leaving the United States rather than money coming in the United States to buy our products.
Typically referred to as we have a trade deficit with our partners.
A current account trade deficit, not a long-term trade deficit, but what we call a current account trade deficit. If you were to include long-term investment accounts, capital accounts, you wouldn't really have much of a trade deficit because the money does eventually come back to the United States in the form of capital. But the president likes to disregard that. and just look at what we call the current account, which is to say stuff and services going back and forth among nations. And in that sense, we do all the time run a very big balance of payments, current account deficit. And the president doesn't like that. Now, the problem is that there's nothing wrong with it. And one of the reasons it exists is because we do have so much investment pouring into the United States. People are pouring money into the United States to invest in the United States, and that money has to go somewhere. And one of the places where it goes is acquiring goods and services from abroad. In other words, it's not just a matter of arithmetic. It's a matter of how things really work. We run a current account deficit so that we can bring in huge amounts of investment. The two go hand in hand because in the long run, they balance out. You don't have situations where a really significant amount of money, in the short term, some money, sure. But in the long run, you don't have significant amounts of money being piled up in one country or another. It flows back and forth and largely balances out over time. But to your point, this is his big concern because he's stuck in 19th century, I would argue 18th century economic views that we used to call mercantilism, which is you accumulate all the gold you can by selling stuff to your other partners in other nations. This is how he sees the world. So Congress, in its limited wisdom also, enacted Section 122, which allows the president to take action through tariffs for, as you said, 5 months to straighten this out a little bit, to discourage imports and to encourage our exports. So he's doing exactly what he has been doing, even increased the tariffs a bit from 10 to 15%, and has 5 months. At the end of has 5 months unilaterally. At the end of 5 months, he can get Congress to extend it. And it may well be the case, John, that Congress, being controlled by the Republican Party, does indeed extend it.
And thanks, but I also want to talk about the optics of this, right? Because the Supreme Court very clearly struck him down. Of course, the president, in a very bizarre weekend, in my view, Mike, starting with a tirade against the Supreme Court, a tirade against the justices that he otherwise would have praised and has praised. He referred to it as a very dumb and stupid decision. He focused clearly on the dissension of Thomas. He promoted that. And he said, okay, so we're doing 122. Keynote here, to my knowledge, I don't think Section 122 has ever been invoked by the president for the purpose of tariffing. The balance of payments issue, to what you said, I think there's legal debate over, does it mean what the president thinks it means regarding trade deficits? I mean, that's something for lawyers to argue, right?
Right. I think he's probably on safe ground here because he gets to decide.
Right. Okay. So much like, and even if he's wrong, it would take another year, like the whole.
Yeah. He's going to be fine. That's the least of his legal problems.
Right. But tell me, Mike, how does it look when the president? This was almost like a childlike tantrum, wasn't it? Okay, you took away my tariffs. I'm going to use this to put 10% on everybody. And FYI for people, the effective tariff rate globally for the president's, the net effect was roughly an 11.5% tariff. That's what it effectively worked out to globally. So he initially goes 10%. And literally less than a day later, he goes, just because you guys pissed me off, let's make it 15, because that's the highest I can go. Like, talk to me about the optics of that. In what a lot of people are saying is like, look, the president is losing his popularity. The latest approval numbers are down to 36%.
Yeah, I think he leaned into his weakest argument, which is justices are stupid and unpatriotic. That's not what I would have gone with, right? Not what I would have gone with. Particularly because 3 of them he appointed.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to argue, well, these guys are too stupid to feed themselves. I wish I hadn't appointed them. Oh, that's stretching just a little bit. And nobody seriously thinks that these people are stupid. You can argue with them. You can say that they're too loose on the Constitution. I wish that they were reading the Constitution more anal retentively, more literally, that the amount of slack that we allow between what Congress allows the president to do, what the president assumes he can do, should be tighter. You can make these arguments, and reasonable people see things differently. I don't think there's a reasonable argument that says any particular justice is devoid of sufficient IQ. I just don't think that that's going to carry a lot of water for most people. And, not that I've tried to take a law class from the Harvard Law School. I'm just guessing, that it's at least as hard as my engineering classes.
Right. So not to give the president sort of tirade credence, because I don't think we're here to do that. I don't think we could do that. But in terms of perception, we've talked about this as being a progressively weakening populist movement for the president, meaning that since he took office, not only is he expending a lot of capital on policies that likely do not work and will not work. We've talked about your opinion and my opinion of tariffs and how effective they are outside of very, very narrow circumstances, that they don't work. They invariably cause inflation. They invariably are a drag on the economy. They might even take up unemployment a little bit. So you've got the economic thing of a bad policy, but now this comes on the heels of the debacle with the Epstein files, the ham-fisted implementation of his immigration policies. That you could say, well, most Americans started out saying we should control the borders, we should take care of the worst offenders, right? Then that went south. Then you've got the whole Venezuela thing, right? So he's expending capital on stuff that was initially packaged as very popular.
Yep.
And now we're at the point only a third of the people roughly approve of his job performance.
We're down under 40% in his approval rating. There was a poll that came out yesterday that suggests that he's still over 40%, but you take your pick. I agree with you. I think this is the right context in which to consider what's actually going on. And one of the things that I think the White House, you and I have said many, many times, I know both of us have, and I say it all the time, the president gets really bad staff work. And the reason I think that it's important now is that all of these issues have been politically challenging for the president because his policies have been bumping up against reality. It's not just a matter of, something outside the White House's control change the minds of American voters, right? It's not like, let me make up a silly example, an unsilly example, but it's silly in the sense that it's unrelated. You might say, well, we're mad at President Roosevelt because he didn't anticipate the Japanese bombing at Pearl Harbor. But a lot of Americans said, I didn't see that coming either. And we're going to cut him some slack because he didn't see it coming. And we know what it is he's trying to do, and we're behind him. This ain't that, right? This ain't that. This is bumping up against the legality of tariffs in the context of the Supreme Court,
right?
But also, to your point, bumping up against the reality that the vast majority of economists, who are correct, by the way, recognize that the tax revenue collected by the government from tariffs is a cost largely borne by Americans, by American consumers, by American businesses, right? And that doesn't even include the effective cost of the disruptions, people losing their job and supply chains having to adjust, buying a different product than the one you really wanted. None of that is taken into consideration.
Right.
With 100 by some estimates, 130 or 175 billion dollars that the government has collected in revenue, that's borne by consumers just in terms of money out of their pockets.
Right.
That's a big cost. And in an environment in which people are concerned about the affordability of, wait for it, everything. You and I have talked about housing costs, and we've talked about the general CPI, the consumer price index. Everything is more expensive than it was before. The vast majority of that is not President Trump's fault, but a lot of people have argued, I believe probably correctly, that he hasn't done enough to address it either. So you've got the reality of concerns, politically speaking. You've got the reality that costs are higher, that things are less affordable for a variety of reasons. And then you put on top of that the reality, not just the politics, the reality that the tariffs cost Americans money.
Right.
That's a problem. And you can't just talk your way around it at the end of the day. And to your point, on the heels of the Epstein files, well, part of the problem with the Epstein files is that there is a reality there. There really is information that the department has not released. And now, if there is any doubt about the extent to which the Department of Justice has been sitting on information, that doubt has been released and has been relieved, because the former Prince Andrew, now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as he's always been called, but now he's known as this, right? He's been arrested by British authorities because of their ability to conduct an investigation more thoroughly based on information that was released by the Department of Justice. In other words, we know that had the Department of Justice released this earlier, Andrew would have gone to jail sooner. So now we know there's no longer merely a matter of politics and perception, right? Now we know with some certainty, and today the second Brit went to jail. That's 2 British subjects, including the King's brother and a former ambassador to the United States, have gone to jail because the Department of Justice was sitting on stuff. This means that it's no longer just a matter of politics. The White House's actions are bumping up against reality, and that's not a good look in the long run for popularity.
I think, because when we were talking about these issues, getting ready for the episode, you mentioned the bumping of reality and politics and policy, and I really hadn't considered it as deeply as what you're now saying, and it's causing me to think, right? Because we've talked before, I've said it before, you've said it before, the fracturing of the MAGA base, right? That there's a certain chunk of people that are going to follow the president regardless. They're just part of that tribe. That's all there is.
And outside of the MAGA base as well. But to your point, that base is going to hang in there pretty firm. There's going to be lots of people all over the United States who just don't give up on one perception of the Epstein files or one perception of tariffs for a variety of reasons. But to your point, the MAGA base is going to hang in there with the president for a long time.
Right. Now that, though, is becoming a shrinking core, correct? So whereas before it might have been 50% true polarization of the country, as we were saying, polls are now suggesting that number is somewhere between the most generous being 40%, like the least generous being, I think, around 32%. So but it's definitely below what it was.
It's a bad range to be in.
It's a very bad range.
32 to 42 is not where you want to be.
Exactly. Now, what I also found interesting is, how long can people keep up with this? As you know, I live on Twitter, I live on X, and you could see that right-wing core having to constantly put out the propaganda and the trolling and deflecting, which is typical, right? But here's something I saw in the middle of all this that I found extremely interesting with respect specifically to the tariffs and what you said, the bumping up of reality with the policy and the perception, which is our favorite foghorn leghorn sound-alike Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a supporter of the president, a Republican senator.
Hey, don't bust on John. He's my boy.
In his best folksy Southern Cajun drawl said, We've got 150 to 400 billion dollars in tariffs collected. My Democrat colleagues are saying, give it back. Well, they better be careful. Be careful what they ask for, because if Trump gives back billions in tariff money to the business community in America, this economy is going to roar, man. And the midterms are only a few months off. A fascinating statement, wouldn't you say, Mike? On again, on several different levels. Talk to me about that statement as being part of what you just described, the perception of reality bumping up against
Well, it
policy.
does suggest that the fact that the president took this money from the American people is a drag that might be reversed, right? If reversing it would goose the economy, it definitely suggests that the economy has been dampened a bit by the removal of these funds from the American pocket. And I think
And the
that
timing of it.
that's
And the timing of it, right?
yeah. Well, that's exactly right. You know, if you're just politicizing this and you want to put money into the economy in order to get some votes, now you sound like a Keynesian employed by the Biden White House. And I'm not sure that's where you want to be either.
Mike, I get a good chuckle out of that statement, but please, please explain for the folks what you meant by it's like having a Keynesian in the White House.
Well, look, Keynesianism is a mid 20th century idea that we can boost the economy by spending money.
Literally right after World War II.
Literally right after World War II. It was suggested as the explanation for how World War II pulled us out of the Depression. And there is some truth to it. A more modern view of economics is that you can make very short run effects on the economy by spending a lot of money. But in the long run, which is not a long period of time, people argue whether it's as short as weeks and months. In the long run, those effects get reversed because the resulting debt has to be paid for. Or if you're going to pay for government spending through taxes, that money is going to come out of consumers' pockets one way or another. So that's going to reverse all of what you might have thought it would be. Or all of that spending is going to be monetized by the Federal Reserve System and wind up as inflation and dampen the economy that way. So there's just, as they say in libertarian circles, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Right. But there are plenty of folks who continue to cling to this idea that if the government could just spend more and more money, our economy would roar. And that's not where you want to be as a modern thinker about how the economy actually works. But as a political matter, it certainly highlights this issue of, do tariffs hurt us or not? I think most Americans are recognizing now that of course they hurt us. Of course they're a tax. And the Supreme Court just reminded you that they're a tax. And I don't think it did the president did himself any good by complaining that the Supreme Court was silent on what to do with the money. It came off as, he didn't say this, but this was the impression, right? In my view, the impression he accidentally gave was, gee, I hadn't really thought of it before. I hadn't planned for this. I would have appreciated some guidance about what to do, right? Well, the Supreme Court wasn't asked what to do about this situation. It just said, you screwed up. You know, now what are you going to do? Well, I think most of us recognize at this point that the answer is going to be the government's going to just have to keep the money, because there's no efficient and effective and cost-effective way of distributing the money back. There's probably going to be 100 lawsuits, but that's chaos.
I was going to say, Mike, that was an interesting part of the decision, what they didn't say, to your point.
Yeah.
So do you think that, now people forget, this case was brought forth by actual American businesses that were harmed by the president's tariffs.
Yep.
I forget the three companies that were actually named in the suit. But
yep.
When these go back now to the federal courts, because that's where this is heading.
That's right.
These companies that brought this suit, this case rather, now have the ability to claim damages and ask for the government to make them whole.
Yeah.
And there has been speculation that now that they've been successful, that all American businesses that paid the excise tax, that paid the tariffs. And again, I think people need to understand this. The checks were written by American businesses. They were not paid by China. They were not paid by Canada or Mexico. They were paid by American importers. So these American citizens, these American companies have the legal right to sue to be made whole.
To seek
How do you see
redress,
that,
as
John?
we say.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're
How do you
absolutely
see this
right.
going?
I would not be shocked if some of these companies were successful in plying their claim. I think that they will try. I think many will try, depending on how quickly the federal government responds. Many will try. The federal government is going to have to go into federal court and say, we can't. That if we give in to company number one, that's going to open us up to liability to 10,000, right? Is probably the order of magnitude of the number of companies that are going to seek redress and want to check. And the cost of fulfilling on that requirement would be enormous, unworkable, unwise, and therefore they're going to petition the court to stay such an order. And the federal government will say, in lieu of that, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Or the government will just argue, no, we can't do it. But I think that their stronger argument would be, in effect, not legally, not literally, but in effect, say, look, this is tantamount to a class action, right?
Right.
You can't force us to give 2% of the money to 1% of the firms, right? The 1% of the firms are asking for 1% of the money, but the cost of fulfilling on this is so enormous that we wouldn't be able to service the others. And
Right, because
it's just unworkable.
It's not just the tariff refunds, it's the interest from over the year that these have been in place.
Oh, yeah.
There might be punitive damages. So
they're going to have to argue that it's just unworkable and come up with some other plan. And I suspect that at the end of the day, the plan is going to be just the government keeps the money.
Do you think that these suits are going to be on the federal level, or do you think they'll be in the International Trade Court?
I think people will try at the international level. I don't think they're going to get anywhere. Because you're going to have to demonstrate that you have standing. To have standing, you're going to have been subjected to it. To have been subjected to it, you're going to have been in the United States. And international court is going to say, look, you got a problem with the American government. You were on American soil. You go do you. We are here to take care of the problems where people can't get standing because of the international nature of transactions. And even if they could get standing in international court, which I do believe someone will try, I think the Trump administration will just say, go pound sand. Right? Yeah. We don't care. Yeah. We didn't care last week. We care even less now that you're mad at us.
Yeah. It reminds me of that line in Casino where the gangster found a foolproof way of winning at gambling. He collected when he won, and he told them to F off when he lost. That was his foolproof. So to the extent, Mike, though, that potentially at least this is a quagmire for the U.S. government. So they've got their new tariffs in place, but the old ones are now a liability for them. They're not assets for them anymore. They're liabilities. Yeah. And I'll throw in my opinion. I do think a company or two will find the right circuit and they will get a judgment. Now, how that gets to your point, whether they actually ever collect.
I agree with you. I think that there could well be judgments, but the government's going to have to step in and ask for a stay and say, you can't give a judgment to this one particular company when there's 9,999 others.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because do you think that judgments, though, or potential judgments, that hamper them, if not bust them? Because again, this isn't coming out of Trump's pocket, right? This will be taxpayer money that'll be returned to these. And again, you feel bad for the companies because they were wrong. They were taxed illegally.
Well, of course they were. I felt bad for them when we thought it was legal.
Well, well, of course, yeah.
Now it's only insult on top of injury.
Well, if you think of it on a personal level, if you and I overpay our taxes, we expect a tax refund, right? When we fill out our taxes, we don't want the government to say, well, you're right, you're owed money, but we're not paying you. Like, right? So
that is a good analogy. And I believe that is the primary vector for the argument that these firms are going to have to make. They're going to have to say, look, there's no such thing in federal court as, well, it's hard. Right? So, it's an entitlement. In effect, judgments are entitlements, right? And, maybe Congress steps in and says, no, but the government, the administration is going to have to find an analogy either to class action, ask for a stay, which is not so easy because even in a class action, you can be ordered to pay everybody no matter how tedious it gets, right? We're all aware that there have been class action settlements for many thousands, many thousands, right? Now, one thing that I'm curious about, and I don't know, is the extent to which good records are I assume the answer is yes. But the big question is, are there good records kept associated with each individual transaction?
Right.
So, assuming the answer is yes, you could imagine the debate that you and I just had and recognized is coming. But at the end of the day, it's not, oh, you're right, you're just going to have to keep the money. Rather, it bounces back up to the Supreme Court because there's going to be multiple issues in multiple federal districts. So eventually it'll probably get to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, I don't know what you want from us. You're right. It's hard. And good luck with that. Good luck with that. But it's the same thing as income tax payments.
Yeah.
By the way, to your point that it ought to be done, I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but I frequently make mistakes on my taxes. Frequently. I don't know how frequently. Like a third of the time, I would say. I make a mistake.
Let's keep you out of trouble. You may have made a mistake or two.
I may have made a mistake or two. Well, the federal government believes I have. Now, it's always a small amount. It's $200, $500, yada, yada, right? Okay. And they send, only in the last few years has this happened. But I'm going to say out of the last decade, I'm going to say approximately 3 times. Months later, I get a letter saying, you screwed this up. Here's your check for $200. Or you screwed this up. You owe us $300. And every time I'm thinking, if you know this, why are you making me file a return? Right?
Right.
Now, if the government has so much information, is so good at processing this, courts know this, you easily could imagine a court saying, I think it's relatively unlikely, but it could happen. A court just says, yeah, it's good. You're right. It's going to be a lot of work. Good luck.
Yeah. And listen, part of the reality is there's going to be judges who are going to say politically, the president is making life tough for me with all these nutty cases. I'm going to make life tough for him by ruling against it. I mean, you could see the human nature of the thing that if you're obstinate with someone, they're going to be obstinate with you. Forget whether it's the president.
The president has not become the court's favorite son.
Right. And we talked about this early on, that it's a losing proposition in the long run if you run around calling every judge that rules against you incompetent, activist, a traitor, unpatriotic. Like, this has been a steady stream of propaganda coming from the White House. Yeah. So to the extent that the courts feel under no obligation, I would think, to give the president the benefit of the doubt wherever possible, I think that if these lawsuits start hitting, and you're right, not every circuit is as favorable to the president or to the federal government, that you might get a lot of these decisions, that as companies file these lawsuits to reclaim. Now, this is going to be happening. They'll be in the weird position of having to refund tariff money while they're still collecting tariff money under these new Section
Yeah, that's a
122
good point. The other
tariffs.
thing that needs to be said is that they might be well advised to say, okay, the tariffs under the law that we had cited originally should not have been cited under that law, but would have been legal had we cited under 120 under Section 122.
Then you have a timing issue, right?
Yes,
Because
you
they've
do.
been in place
But maybe that gets you off the hook of the refund.
for the first 5 months. Yes, you're right. For the first 150 days, it would get you off the hook. Then there would be it would create an even bigger mess. It might cut down your total obligations, to your point, and it would be.
But I would okay. But if I'm the White House attorney, right? I'm gonna the Solicitor General. You've got to argue. At no point did we know that it was illegal because you hadn't told us yet. Not only did we believe it was legal, and we believe you got the case wrong, but furthermore, we're continuing the tariffs under a different law, which are substantially the same thing. So there's really no injury to these firms. It's just a matter of having cited it under the wrong statute, and that does not per se convey an injury.
Which on the surface,
that's what I would go with.
Yeah, it sounds a little goofy, but I guess a parallel rather sort of thing would be the concept of inevitable discovery, right? Like as a cop, right? You would say, I might have technically violated their Fourth Amendment rights, but
I would have found out about it anyway. You're right. I shouldn't have I shouldn't have searched the car.
Right.
But given that we were going to impound the car eventually, we eventually would have searched it. So even though I've been naughty, you can't throw out the evidence that we found in the car. Right. Just to explain the inevitability that you were citing.
So it's kind of a parallel argument. It'd be interesting to see if that happens, because then you could imagine a whole bunch of nonsense getting retrofitted under that argument, right?
Well, that's right. So, but to your point, using the word inevitability, what you got to say is we inevitably would have accrued that revenue.
We would have figured out that.
We would have figured out. Your Honor, one way or another, we would have taken this money.
All right. Yes, absolutely. We would have figured out a way to hold up the American taxpayer once again. Okay. Now, given that we are where we are, the tariffs are here, the president now seems even more determined to push through even more tariffs to the maximum that he thinks the law allows him to do. Let's talk about the actual economic impact, Mike. We're looking at potential inflation effects of anywhere from 0.6 to 1%, which translates into a typical household cost of somewhere between $800 to $1,300. We're talking about a drag on GDP. We're talking about an increase in unemployment numbers. Tariffs typically take anywhere, Mike, you tell me, about a year for them to see. Once they're fully in place and people have accepted them, it takes about a year for those effects to hit, right? Because right now, because of the president's whipsawing on tariffs, one day they're 15%, then they're 10, then they're 150, So basically, we talked about this. There was a lot of front loading of inventory where possible by businesses, and then they've just not made business investments. They've just been sitting on their eggs. They're like, okay, let's see where this ends up before we make decisions.
Yep.
But about a year after that is when you start seeing the real effects. You see minor drags now. Tell me, how do you see the economy being affected now that we know that for at least the next 5 months, heading into the midterms, to Senator Kennedy's point, heading into midterms now, we're going to have these 15% tariffs fully in place.
I think that companies that import goods or even compete with imported goods are in a real pickle when it comes to making decisions. I feel for anyone who's cutting their margins razor thin and for whom a 15% tariff on everything they import really makes a big difference at the end of the day, because you quite literally can't know whether or not this is going to last for a long time. You can't know that. You know it's going to be at least another 5 months. You have no idea whether or not you're going to get a refund. Probably not. And probably at the end of that 5 months, Congress is going to give you an extension, or the White House is going to try a new legal theory under which to impose these tariffs. So my advice to firms would be, and consumers, to the extent to which, there are things that you import that you need to be able to continue importing versus looking for a new product, is plan for the tariffs to land for the rest of the Trump administration. How big an effect this has on GDP is hard to know. I think that, honestly, I think those are upper end boundaries on how much the effect actually is, because the economy is relatively creative. Mm-hmm. When you have a tax, it pops out in the money goes somewhere, I guess is how I would put that. You can't just assume that you have shrunk GDP by the amount of the tax. It eventually circulates back one way or another, whether it's reduced borrowing or greater government spending someplace else. So I think the real issue here is the perception. In other words, GDP has not been growing very rapidly during the president's first year of his second term, right?
Right.
That's a problem in this context. Let me make up an example. You'd be better off if the tariffs really were hurting GDP by 2%, if GDP were growing at 4% a year.
Right.
Then maybe the reality is it's only hurting GDP by 0.5% a year, but because GDP's only been growing by 1.5%, people are very sensitive to it.
Yeah.
It just looms larger in an environment that's slow growth.
Right. Yeah. The chunk is bigger, relatively speaking.
Yep.
And you would still have inflationary pressure, though, from these tariffs.
Yeah. Right? And again, to your point, it's more important because we can't get inflation back down to 2%. Inflation keeps up around 3%, right? You had the huge inflation coming off of all of the spending coming off of COVID. It came down during the Biden administration, down. Trump comes to power. It stays relatively low, but it never gets down to 2%. And prices are so much higher than they were in 2019, 2018, so much higher. And we had cost pressure coming off of the 2009, 2008 recession that we still haven't really recovered from, especially in housing. So people are very concerned about affordability, rationally so. This isn't just something made up by CNN.
Right.
So here you've got this situation where people are particularly concerned about prices, and you're pushing tariffs. It's just bad timing.
And Mike, also a piece of this that people may have forgotten or overlooked is business investment, both domestically and internationally, right? So, and again, these are all pieces of a puzzle, right? So you have inflation, you have inflationary pressures upward, you have, even if it's slight in the context, you have downward pressure on GDP thanks to these tariffs. Unemployment, I think, has been holding steady, but again, we're looking at a year down the road when a lot of these effects have fully taken hold. So there's a chance that a decent chance unemployment ticks up.
Yep.
But you're also not dealing with businesses that are like, why would I invest in the U.S.? Why would I invest in the U.S. economy when I don't know day to day if I'm getting paid?
Yep.
If the president is going to decide that I'm a national security threat, so my business gets blocked unless I pay a VIG to the government. We've seen NVIDIA, we've seen Intel have to go through that, right?
Absolutely.
So how does that work for the president?
It works badly, and it works exactly against what it is that he's been trying to foster, which is greater direct investment in the United States. And let me just real quick, at the risk of being too nerdly, even by our standards, address how payment balances can cycle in the wrong direction. In other words, when you become a nation in which everybody wants to invest, right? The money comes pouring in.
Right.
That money has to go somewhere. And you use it to buy goods and stuff. So you buy all this stuff, the stuff comes flowing in, the money goes back out, and it recirculates in the form of capital investment because you're still where everyone wants to invest. That's when the cycle is going the right way. Guess what? It's a two-way street, right? If you are no longer the nation that everyone views as a nation of laws, a nation of entrepreneurialism, a nation where the regime can be trusted to set taxes, set tariffs, set regulations, and stick by them forever. If you're no longer that nation, that doesn't work very well. And so the money isn't flowing in, and now you don't have the money to acquire goods from abroad. That will fix your balance of payments problem. You can't import as much stuff as you were, but not the way you want to, right?
Right.
And this is why we always try to point out that President Trump is complaining about something that's not bad. The fact that you have a current account balance of payments problem just means you're getting lots of goods and services, stuff to come into your country. The money is going out, but the money's coming back in the form of investment, which creates businesses and drives up our wage rate. That's why we're the wealthiest nation in the world, because this cycle works really well for us.
Right.
But one of the ways that you see it not working, one of the early indicators will be when the money doesn't flow in the form of investment,
right,
and the dollar becomes weaker. When the dollar becomes weaker and then you can't buy the stuff from abroad, that's a problem.
Mike, you just hit on the final leg of what I wanted to talk to you about, which, before we do, which is the currency. For people to, I always use this example because I think it hits it home. Think of how many trade deficits each one of us maintains in our daily lives as average citizens, right? I go to the grocery store. I spend way more with them than they will ever spend. The grocery store has not spent a nickel to support me, but I'm happy. I go to the grocery store. I get what I need. It's usually at a decent price. When you go to the car mechanic, when I pay the oil company to heat the house, every day I would venture that 99% of my transactions are the result of a trade deficit that I have with various businesses. So for people to say President Trump is right, and listen, I don't think he is, but even if you think he is, please understand you are advocating for an anomaly. Think about what you do on a daily basis. You're constantly living in trade deficits, right?
Right.
So that's just a practical way of looking at it. The second thing is, it's not talked enough about, is the strength of the dollar.
Yep.
Since President Trump's taken office, it's down roughly 15%. We've talked a lot about our sovereign debt, our T-bills and everything losing value, and that the U.S. is starting to show cracks, or the dollar, rather, is starting to show cracks as a reserve currency. We've talked about OPEC countries starting to accept the yuan as a settlement currency instead of the dollar, which was formerly unheard of before President Trump took office. Why is that important? Why should Americans be concerned about the strength of the dollar and its status as a reserve currency? How does that play into all this?
Well, two reasons. One is in terms of trade that we just discussed. It means we can buy less stuff from abroad and people will invest less in us. Both of those are bad things.
Which means higher prices. For Joe Plumber, to bring back an old meme, it means you're paying more everywhere, right?
Yep. So just that cycle not spinning as fast means your life isn't as good. Right. But to the extent to which it spins at all, things are more expensive. So if the dollar is 15% weaker, that means every time you spend $100 today, you're only getting the equivalent of what you would have spent, right? $85 for a year ago. Okay, so right there, your life is worse. And that scales up. The government has, to pick a round number, $30 trillion of debt. Well, that's a big number, and that stinks. And that's hard to service. You got to pay interest on it. You got to pay principal on it. Then you got to, refinance the principal because we don't have the money. That's a problem. It's an even worse problem when it's 34 and a half instead of 30, because it's effectively 15% more,
right?
Because the dollar is worth less relative to other currencies. That's a problem. To the extent to which international investors are buying our bonds, to the extent to which Americans are buying it, never mind. But to the extent to which others are buying, which is huge, especially China, right? Which is huge, that means we have to give them a higher interest rate to get them to buy our stuff. That's a real cost, and that comes out of our pockets in the form of future taxes. So every way you look at it, having a strong dollar has been a real boon to our wealth and to our economy, and that has been undermined in a big way. And you're right, we don't talk about it very much. But when you want to say, our nation is hot, we're the hottest nation in the world right now, the first thing that international economists would look to is, how has your currency been doing? And ours has been in the tank.
So one has to ask, Mike, assuming that the president is just not malevolent, right? Is it, I'll say it plainly, you don't have to use these words, is it a matter of economic ignorance, or is there something else at play? Why would someone knowingly go down this path? I refuse to believe that the president's staff, if nothing else, are unaware of these effects of tariffs.
No, the Treasury Secretary knows damn well what's going on. He's in a very awkward position. Watches Adam's Apple in the interview on CNN on Sunday. Dead giveaway. He is in an extremely stressful position because he knows damn well what's going on. Donald Trump is not stressing it nearly as bad. He actually believes that tariffs are a good idea.
What would be the good out of tariffs then? What does the president see as the benefit of tariffs? Help me understand this as if I'm a fan of the president.
The president loves tariffs for two reasons. One, it raises hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And he believes incorrectly that it is largely paid by foreigners. But even to the extent to which it's paid by Americans, hey, it's tax revenue just like income tax, and the government could use the money. The problem is that it's a brutally inefficient tax. For every dollar that you recruit, you cause much more disruption than a dollar recruited from an income tax.
Right. Or a sales tax.
Which have much larger bases and therefore require a much lower rate of tax. So that's a problem. The government also, the Trump administration, the president, I should say, also likes the idea that it puts pressure on firms that are importing things, thereby allowing domestic manufacturers to compete more robustly, creating manufacturing jobs here at home, rather than jobs related to importing or jobs in other sectors, not the sectors that are being disadvantaged by competition, fair competition.
And you hear that all the time, right? Like if you just bought American, you wouldn't have to worry about tariffs. What's the fallacy there?
The fallacy is that we're better off being able to buy cheap stuff from elsewhere. And when you do, you get a much more efficient economy, which in the long run drives up wages. And you get a much more efficient allocation of labor across various types of businesses. In other words, you don't want to protect your 20th century businesses, right? And then trap all of your labor in 20th century businesses where the growth is not as great. And parenthetically, that are eventually going to go away anyway. We propped up the automobile industry for decades, protecting them with tariffs and weird rules that made it difficult for Japanese cars and European cars to compete in the United States. Well, those markets eventually collapsed. And the result was absolute economic devastation in Detroit without a smooth decline that you would have had over decades had you kept the government out of it. And so we wound up with these giant disruptions. Consider today, the unemployment rate is very, very low. Our economy, in terms of employment, is very strong. We want to keep it that way. We don't want the disruptions that come from imposing tariffs and then the tariffs going off, right? It's bad enough that because we do all the stupid things we do in our economy by allowing the federal government to interrupt these businesses through tariffs and other taxes, it's bad enough that it inhibits economic growth, that our economic growth is so low, that wages aren't growing as fast as they could. These are the penalties we pay by allowing the government to do stupid things. But when you impose big tariffs and then take them off, the disruptions can really be devastating, much worse than just national slow growth, right? When a particular industry fails because you have artificially propped it up for years and then the protection eventually goes away, that's devastating. Or the alternative, which is a company that has been, or an industry that's been dependent on being able to import things, right? A lot of farms are in this category, needing certain chemicals that they import from abroad. When they can no longer do that, the whole industry gets wiped out, and all of a sudden you've got bad unemployment, farm failures. These effects can be very devastating that don't show up in a GDP number.
Right. Not to mention also that typically tariffs will trigger trade wars, which means even those farmers, to use your example, now can't export their goods for the same reason that they can't import their chemicals, right? It becomes much more difficult, it becomes much more expensive, and you're just killing the economy.
Yeah, trade war with China has devastated soy farmers.
Oh, to the extent that the president has had to
give them money,
subsidies.
Ironically,
so you're paying for it twice. Yeah, you're paying for it twice. Whereas before they could sell soybeans to their heart's content and make a living, now they can't sell their soybeans and they have to go to the federal government for relief.
We make fun of governments that do things this stupid.
Yeah, it is literally biting your nose to spite your face. Okay, last question, Mike. I'll give you the last word on this. Should and will Congress reclaim its tariff authority?
No, it won't. As a matter of fact, I believe it'll go the other direction. It will explicitly give it away by extending the Section 122 tariffs that the president is running right now. I further believe that I have to eat my quasi-prediction of some weeks ago when I said, if the president can get his messaging on the economy back on track, it is conceivable that the Republican Party, that we would stave off a loss of control of the House. And it does not look, tonight is the State of the Union. Mm-hmm. If the president does not start getting things back on track right now, if he just doubles down on tariffs, misaligning his policies and his rhetoric with the American public's interests, he's cooked in November. And that has a cascading effect. If the public does not trust that the Trump administration's policies are in line with their interests, then all of a sudden that mistrust can have a contagion effect that could bleed over to other issue areas. For example, if the president's approval ratings are falling and you don't trust all of a sudden the decisions that he's making in foreign policy, that can be very, very damaging to his presidency, even beyond the midterms.
I agree. And certainly the midterms now, if things keep at this pace, to your point, like I was doubtful they were going to keep control, but now to that episode you're referring to, I think my thing becomes even a little bit more possible, which is a blue wave, not because Democrats have better ideas, but simply because nobody trusts the president anymore. Nobody trusts the Republicans anymore. And we'll see what happens, especially to his tariff authority for the remainder of his presidency. If he gets rebuked in November and the House goes, the Senate probably won't. But if the House goes, you might see pressure for the House, especially, to reclaim its tariff authority. So we'll see what happens, but it'll be interesting going forward. All right, you've been watching Liberty Lens right here, and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Please follow us, leave a comment or two. Mike and I always love to see and hear what you have to say. All right, until next week when we'll do this again. This has been Big John with my co-host, Mr. Mike Termott. We'll catch you again next week. Peace, everyone.